am Lucinda Curran, your host for the Environmental Sensitivities Symposium, a world-first event, and today I have the pleasure of introducing you to Professor Martin Pall. Good afternoon, Professor. How are you?
Just fine, thanks.
Could you tell us about the work that you do, please?
That actually is a more difficult question to answer than you might think. I was an experimental scientist for most of my career, and starting about 1998, I started working in a very different way on various kinds of disease mechanisms and how environmental stressors have roles and various other relationships, digging information out of the medical literature and trying to make connections that other people have not made. And this has been a really exciting thing, and I've published now on 23 different diseases. Some people don't consider them all diseases. I've published on how chemicals work to initiate disease. I've published on how electromagnetic fields work to impact the cells of our body and cause disease. And things are getting more and more active as time goes on.
It's amazing the sort of work that you do, because you've also written a book about unexplained illnesses. Could you tell us a little about that, please?
It was published in 2007, and it was focused mainly on ME/CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis, and on multiple chemical sensitivity, fibromyalgia, and to a lesser extent post-traumatic stress disorder. But I also talk about a lot of other diseases as being caused by a vicious cycle mechanism, which I call the no-ono cycle. And we can talk about that name if you'd like. And now, as I've said, I've published on 23 different diseases that I believe are caused by that same mechanism, depending on where it's localized in the body.
Could we talk a little bit more about the no-ono cycle? That'd be great.
Okay. Well, it's a vicious cycle. It is caused by 23 different mechanisms, each of which is a well-established mechanism. And the only thing that's really new and different is that when you put them together, you come up with this very complex vicious cycle mechanism, which, once it gets started, tends to propagate itself over time. That's the way vicious cycles work. And because it's in effect a combination of multiple vicious cycles, it's very difficult to downregulate, which of course is what you want to do when it's causing disease. But it has a lot of different elements to it, 12 total, and they include not only NO, which is nitric oxide, and peroxynitrite, ONO-, so that's where the name comes from, but a whole lot of other things, including inflammatory aspects and mitochondrial dysfunction. So the mitochondria, the parts of cells that generate energy, are dysfunctional. It includes some receptors on cell membranes that are involved and increased levels of calcium in the cell. So all of those interact with each other, and they all act to keep this cycle going.
And earlier you mentioned that one of the things you really are doing in your work is making links that other people aren't making. Could you tell us how you came to be doing that? Because I think it sounds so exciting.
Well, the thing that you have to understand here is that we are in an era of highly focused, highly specialized science. And the reason we're in that era is because to be an experimental scientist, you have to be highly focused. You have to essentially argue, I am either the expert or one of a tiny number of experts in a particular field. And there's this problem that needs to be resolved, and therefore you should give me money to do it. That's the basic argument that you make when you write a grant proposal to try to get funding for a research lab. And so people have been basically becoming much more highly focused over time, and what the consequence of that is there are all kinds of things that don't fall into specific areas that get neglected. And so what I've been doing is basically what I say nobody else does, and that's almost true, but that may be a slight exaggeration, trying to make connections. And I do that by reading the scientific literature and making connections where other people have not made them. And so what I do then is I publish on these connections and what kinds of conclusions you can draw from them. And so rather than adding to this huge literature, what I do is I take advantage of it, and a lot of this literature basically is wasted because nobody has time to read it. That's this this information that's been generated at huge cost. A lot of it is in effect wasted. So anyway, as I say, that's what I've been doing since 1998, and I've been very successful at that.
I think it's wonderful because, as you say, there's so much that's coming out. I guess a really big weakness is it is so highly focused, although that's a benefit as well. But being able to really draw on what's been done and make the connections, and I guess looking at it more sort of from that meta level, looking more broadly and drawing it together to make it relevant and useful is a significant thing that you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I decided that it's possible to do that if you have the breadth of background to put together with some depth of background and the kind of mind that you need to do it. It can be done because we have these computerized databases that allow you to access information at no cost, instantaneously, using the internet and a PC. And so the ability to do it is there if you have the type of mind that likes to do those kinds of things, has the capability of doing those things. But the problem basically is you can't get money to do this, so nobody will pay you to say, hey, this something needs to be done. But I just decided I was going to do it anyway, so that's what I've been doing.
I think that's great. And how is it that you came to work in the field that you do? So in terms of chemical sensitivities, electrical hypersensitivity, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, how did that come about? What led you to work in that area?
Well, I got interested in it basically because I had chronic fatigue syndrome. Came down with a case in 1997 and had a full recovery over about a year and a half. So that was unusually rapid for CFS. So I decided, first of all, I was going to solve that problem, which I think I have done, but obviously everybody doesn't accept that. But it became clear that there were relationships between CFS and fibromyalgia and multiple chemical sensitivity, and later EHS has become part of that. So what I find is that even though you might expect that looking at one confusing area would be more simple than looking at several, in fact, what is often the case is when you look at several, each of them gives you insights into the others that you wouldn't have otherwise. And so in some senses, looking at several at the same time can be useful, and that's been my experience. It's kind of how we've learned about the no-no cycle and how it's become somewhat more complex over time is by looking at different diseases and how it seems to apply to them.
I think it's fascinating because when I look at it, I mean, I'm coming from my Chinese medicine mindset, but there's such a big overlap as well as the differentiations within each of those. So to me, it would make sense to do exactly what you're doing and to be looking and to be informed by each of them as well.
Western medicine has this idea that each disease is distinct from the others, and that the most important thing you can do is to do what's called differential diagnosis. You say, well, it's not this, and it's not that, and it's not the other thing, but it really looks like it's this, and so that's the diagnosis. But what's, I think, become clear is that there are a lot of diseases where the separations are uncertain, let's say, and where they tend to run into each other. And so immediately that whole approach to medicine becomes questionable. If you have a mechanism then which is primarily local and can be localized in different tissues in different individuals, you can get almost infinite variations depending on where it's localized. So the no-no cycle really looks at chronic disease in a very different way from what has been the conventional view in Western medicine.
And everybody, Professor Martin Pall will be a speaker at the Environmental Sensitivities Symposium. You can find out more at environmentalsensitivities-symposium.com.